This is an overview of integrating sources. There are three basic ways to use source material. First, to summarize them. Second, to paraphrase. And third, to quote from your source. Summaries are shorter than the original. They will include the main idea from the original, but they won't include the details in the examples. Because a summary is shorter, you can summarize an entire work, an entire book, an entire article, or maybe just part of it, a chapter, a paragraph, even a segment. Because you're making it shorter, the length of your summary depends on how much you condense the original. When you're summarizing, you want to acknowledge that with a citation. You don't need to give a page number if you're summarizing the entire document. So if your parenthetical citation does not narrow down the location of what you're summarizing any more than your works cited entry, then you don't need to put that page number. But if, say, you're summarizing a few pages from a book, but you're citing in your works cited the entire book, then you would need to put those pages to show us where your summary is coming from. The best time to use a summary is if the entire argument of that source is relevant to your discussion. You need to give that author's main idea to support your argument. Sometimes the source provides an opposing viewpoint, and you want to include that opposing viewpoint, but you don't want to spend too much time on it because you want to give the most time to your ideas, so then you might choose to summarize. Sometimes the argument serves as a subpoint of your own. It's important to one of your supporting points, but not your main idea, so you only want to bring it in briefly, and then you might choose to use a summary. One situation in which summaries are used quite frequently is the literature review. That's where you kind of go through what other people have said on the subject so your readers know that you've done your research and see where you're joining the conversation. A lot of research papers will begin with this. So say you're doing an essay on the effect of participating in athletics on children. You might talk about the most recent studies that have been done or the most important studies that have been done and what they found before you start talking about your own findings. Paraphrasing is when you're changing the original to your own words. In that way it's like a summary because a summary is also your own words. However, a paraphrase is not shorter. It's usually about the same length of the original, maybe slightly shorter, but not much, and sometimes it's even longer. You have to make sure you're changing both the words and the sentence structure of whatever you're paraphrasing. We'll talk about that more in the paraphrasing lecture. Because a paraphrase is going to be the same length as the original, you have to do that with a short section, usually a sentence. If you were paraphrasing a book, you'd be writing a book. If you were paraphrasing a chapter, you'd be writing a chapter. So obviously that's not something that you're going to be doing. You might be paraphrasing a sentence, paraphrasing a couple of sentences at once. When you use paraphrase, you acknowledge that with a citation and you give the page number. Even though that's your own words, you still have to give the source credit for the ideas, and you want to tell us where in that source those ideas come from. The best time to use a paraphrase is if you're using factual information or specific ideas, but the exact wording used is not important. So you want to communicate the information, but you don't have to communicate the exact same words. Sometimes you'll be paraphrasing something because the original passage is very technical or complex. Maybe you need to change the wording so that other people can understand it because you'll be writing for a general audience in this class. So you may need to make it something that people will understand. You also want to be maintaining consistency in your writing. So if you want to keep your own authorial voice, you might change the idea into your own words to keep that consistent. Or if you're using certain vocabulary and you want to keep using that vocabulary but your source uses different words, then you could paraphrase into your own words in order to keep your vocabulary. Quotation is when you're reproducing the source word for word. You're literally copying exactly what they say. It might be a phrase, a sentence, or several sentences. Obviously, it has to be short like a paraphrase. If you were quoting a book, you'd be handing me a book instead of an essay, so we wouldn't do that. You can alter your quotations for grammatical consistency using brackets and ellipses as long as you're not changing the meaning, and we'll talk about that more in the quotation lecture. And when you're doing a quotation, you want to do two things. You want to acknowledge that the words are from someone else by putting quotation marks around it, and you acknowledge the source by including a citation and a page number. So remember, with a summary, you give us a citation and you give us as narrow as possible to where it is. With a paraphrase, you give us a citation and you tell us exactly where it came from with the page number. And with a quotation, you show us that it is word for word with quotation marks and you have your citation and page number. So you have to give more information to show us that those words are someone else's too. There are situations in which you choose to quote a short passage. It's the best strategy. Maybe you want to rely on your source's language to lend credibility to your argument. So we'll be talking about ethos and how you want people to find you credible. And if you use a good source, using their language can add to that credibility. Sometimes your source uses striking or memorable language and you really want to keep that. Have you ever heard someone say something or read something and you thought, that's exactly how I feel or what I wanted to say, but I just couldn't say it as well? In that situation, you'd probably want to choose to quote so you could keep their words that you find that they've written so well. Sometimes the exact wording of something is very important. For example, if you're talking about laws, the exact way a law is worded is important. You wouldn't want to just give us your interpretation of it. We need to see exactly what it says. So in that case, you'd want to use a quotation. Finally, when you want to use a short passage instead of a long passage might be if you need to interrupt that quotation to break down its meaning. So you might want to quote a little bit from your passage and then explain what that means for your argument, and then quote a little bit more later. You also have the option of quoting a longer passage, but this is a strategy that should not be overused. You want your essay to be in your own voice. You don't want to do this more than once per 5 pages of essay, so you probably don't want to do this at all in your shorter essays. Sometimes that entire passage is relevant and the language is important. Sometimes it relates to your argument so fully that you don't need to interrupt to explain it. And sometimes you can't really eliminate part of the quotation, so you have to use the whole thing. If you do use this strategy, keep in mind that you have to use special formatting called block formatting for longer quotations, and that means more than 4 lines in length in MLA format. No matter which kind of integration you're using, one way to introduce those information from the source is to use an attributive tag. That's where you acknowledge the source within the sentence. So you say, according to Jim Johnson, or in an essay written by Maria Thomas. So you're acknowledging that source. Doing this lends ethos to your argument. You're showing where your sources are from. You're recognizing them. You can also add extra information like the author's qualifications or the source of publication. So your parenthetical citation will contain the author's last name and page number. That doesn't really tell us much. So if you want us to know that this person is, say, a respected professor at MIT, then you can put that in an attributive tag. So you could say, Jim Johnson, a respected professor at MIT, argues, instead of just giving us, oh, this is Johnson. And that doesn't tell us that much. You can also use those attributive tags to show the relationship between the source material, your own ideas, and other sources. So, contrary to Smith, Jones argues. Or, Harris supports my point by stating. Those kinds of things. So it can really help your essay. A lot of times students stay away from these. They feel like it puts too much emphasis on the sources they're using, but attributive tags are actually a really great way to build ethos. And to create flow within your paper. So I definitely recommend that you use attributive tags. I also recommend that you use a mixture of summary, paraphrase, and quotations. Look over your essays. Make sure that you're doing all of those things in your essays. Because if I see an essay that has only quotations, I might think that you either don't know you need to cite paraphrasing or you don't know how to paraphrase. If I see an essay that uses only paraphrasing, I might think that you don't know how to use quotations. So you want to show me that you know how to use both for the sake of the class, and also using a mixture is most effective writing strategy as well, because as we discussed, there are different situations in which different methods are the most appropriate to use.